There is something profound about the way human beings mark death. Throughout our species' long history, we have surrounded the end of life with ceremony, with ritual, with meaning. We build monuments, we gather together, we tell stories about those who have departed. But in the ancient world, in a time before our modern sensibilities took shape, some cultures chose to honor their dead in ways that strike us now as utterly foreign. They chose blood. Long before Rome became an empire, before it conquered the Mediterranean world, before its legions marched across continents, there lived a people in the hills of central Italy who possessed a curious belief. The Etruscans, as we know them, flourished in the centuries before Rome's ascendance. Their civilization has largely vanished, absorbed into the Roman world that followed. Yet they left behind something that would echo through the ages. They believed that blood spilled at a funeral could nourish the spirit of the deceased, could ease their passage into the afterlife, could honor their memory in the most visceral way imaginable. Consider for a moment what this means. When a prominent Etruscan died, when a warrior or chieftain breathed his last, his family did not simply mourn in quiet reflection. They gathered prisoners of war, captives taken in battle, and they made these men fight to the death at the graveside. The blood that soaked into the earth was an offering. The violence was sacred. The dying warriors were, in a sense, sacrifices, their lives given to accompany the dead into whatever realm awaited beyond. This was not entertainment, not at first. This was religion. This was duty. This was how one properly said goodbye to a man of importance. The Romans in their early days were neighbors to the Etruscans. They learned from them, they traded with them, they fought against them, and they absorbed their customs, the way cultures always do when they live side by side for generations. When Rome was still a republic, still finding its identity among the many peoples of Italy, it adopted this Etruscan practice. But something curious happened in that adoption, something that would change the course of history. The first recorded gladiatorial combat in Rome took place in the year 264 before the Common Era. It was the funeral of a nobleman named Junius Brutus Pera. His sons, seeking to honor their father's memory in the grandest way they knew, arranged for 3 pairs of slaves to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, the cattle market of Rome. 6 men entered combat. 3 emerged alive. The blood soaked into Roman soil for the first time in this ritualized manner, and something stirred in the Roman heart. You see, the Romans were a practical people, but they were also a people who understood spectacle. They understood the power of public display, and they noticed something remarkable happening in that cattle market. People came to watch, not just family members paying respects, but ordinary Romans, drawn by curiosity, by the primal fascination that violence holds for the human mind. They gathered in growing numbers. They watched with intensity, and when the fights concluded, they talked about what they had seen. This was the seed from which an entire institution would grow. But that growth took time. For decades, these funeral games remained relatively modest affairs. A few pairs of fighters here and there, staged by wealthy families seeking to honor their dead. The fights still carried religious significance. They were still munus, a duty performed for the deceased. But gradually, imperceptibly at first, the nature of these events began to shift. The Roman Republic was expanding. Its legions marched into new territories, conquered new peoples, brought back new wealth and new prisoners. War captives flooded into Rome, men from a dozen different cultures, speaking a dozen different languages. Many became slaves working in fields or households. But some, particularly those with military training, those who had fought against Rome, found themselves selected for a different fate. They would fight again, but this time in ritualized combat, at the funerals of Roman citizens. Imagine being such a captive. You have fought for your homeland, fought bravely perhaps, but fortune turned against you. You survived the battle only to be marched in chains to Rome, a city beyond anything you have known. You are purchased, along with others, by a wealthy Roman family. You are fed, housed in cramped quarters, given basic training in combat techniques you may not know, and then, one day, you are led into a public space, given weapons, and told to fight another man to the death while Romans watch and cheer. What goes through your mind in those moments? Terror, certainly. Rage, perhaps. A desperate will to survive. These men were not trained athletes. They were not professionals. They were prisoners forced into mortal combat, and their struggles were raw and desperate and often brutal in their simplicity. But here is where the story becomes fascinating, because even in these early days, patterns began to emerge. Certain fighters showed remarkable skill. Others displayed extraordinary courage. The crowd began to distinguish between combatants, to remember names, to anticipate matches. The simple act of watching men fight to the death started to become something more complex. It became a spectacle with its own aesthetics, its own values, its own heroes. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, the games were growing larger. In 174 BCE, a funeral game featured 74 gladiators fighting over 3 days. 74 men, crossing blades in pairs while thousands watched. This was no longer a modest tribute. This was an event that consumed resources, that required organization, that demanded attention from the entire city. The fighters themselves were changing too. Rome began establishing training. Schools, places where captives and slaves could be taught. Proper combat techniques could be turned from desperate prisoners into skilled warriors. These schools, called ludi, were brutal institutions, but they served a purpose. They transformed raw violence into refined violence. They created fighters who could put on a proper show. And the Romans, increasingly, wanted a show. They wanted to see technique. They wanted to see courage. They wanted drama and tension and moments of extraordinary bravery or shocking cowardice. The religious element began to fade into the background. The entertainment element moved to the forefront. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded across generations, shaped by hundreds of individual decisions made by ambitious families, by crowds that came to watch, by fighters who learned to play to the audience. But by the 1st century before the Common Era, something remarkable had occurred. What began as solemn funeral rites had become Rome's favorite form of public entertainment. The turning point came with politics. Roman politicians, always seeking advantages, always looking for ways to win public favor, discovered that sponsoring grand games could make you extremely popular. In 105 BCE, the consul Publius Rutilius Rufus staged games that were not funeral games at all, but simply entertainment. He broke the religious pretense. He offered the games to the public as a gift, as a display of his wealth and generosity. Others followed. Politicians competed to stage more elaborate spectacles. They imported exotic animals from Africa. They constructed temporary arenas. They purchased the finest fighters. The games became a currency of political power, and that power was intoxicating. Julius Caesar, in his early political career, staged games featuring 320 pairs of gladiators, all equipped with silver armor that glittered in the sun. The expense was staggering. The impact on his popularity was immense. The Roman Senate, alarmed by how much influence these games gave ambitious men, tried to limit the number of gladiators any individual could sponsor. But the appetite was already established. The people wanted their games, and politicians would provide them. Now the fighters were becoming celebrities. Successful gladiators, men who won fight after fight, became known throughout Rome. Women fell in love with them. Children imitated their fighting styles. Vendors sold clay figurines in their likenesses. These were still slaves, still men without freedom, still combatants who might die in their next fight. But they were also something else. They were heroes of a strange and violent kind. The contradiction was not lost on Romans themselves. Here were men of the lowest social status, slaves and prisoners, who nonetheless commanded admiration and fascination. They lived outside normal society, yet occupied the very center of public attention. They faced death with regularity, yet some amassed small fortunes through their victories. The best fighters could win their freedom through the rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing manumission, yet many, even when offered freedom, chose to continue fighting. The arena became their identity. Violence became their purpose. There is something deeply human in all of this, something that transcends the specific culture of ancient Rome. We are drawn to combat, to tests of skill and courage, to moments when life hangs in the balance. Every human society has found ways to channel this fascination, to create contexts where violence becomes ritualized, controlled, meaningful. The Romans simply took this universal impulse and expanded it to a scale never before attempted. But in doing so, they created something that would define their civilization in the eyes of history. When we think of Rome today, we think of the Colosseum, of gladiators, of crowds roaring for blood. We think of thumbs turned up or down, of victory or death, of sand stained red beneath a Mediterranean sun. The institution that began with 6 men fighting at a funeral would grow into an empire-wide phenomenon, would shape Roman culture for centuries, would leave a legacy that still haunts our imagination. The funeral games of the early Republic seem almost innocent compared to what would come later. Those first fighters, those Etruscan captives spilling their blood for another man's passage to the afterlife, could not have imagined what they were beginning. They were simply trying to survive another day. They were following orders, raising their weapons, facing their opponents with whatever courage they could muster. Yet their blood soaked into Roman soil, and something grew from it. An appetite, an institution, a darkness that Rome would embrace with enthusiasm, that would become inseparable from Roman identity. The games would grow beyond funerals, beyond religion, beyond any noble purpose. They would become pure spectacle, pure entertainment, pure violence performed for its own sake. But that transformation was still unfolding. In these early days, in the simple cattle markets and small arenas of Republican Rome, the gladiators were just beginning their journey into history. They were not yet legends. They were not yet symbols of an empire's glory and cruelty. They were simply men who fought and died while others watched. And the watching, that was perhaps the most significant element of all, because it established a relationship, a transaction between performer and audience, between the one who risks everything and the many who risk nothing. The crowd held power over these fighters, could grant them favor or condemn them, could celebrate their victories or dismiss their deaths with a shrug. And the fighters, in turn, fought not just to survive, but to be worthy of the crowd's attention, to earn their applause, to become memorable in the brief span between birth and death. This was the world that was being born in. Republican Rome. This was the foundation being laid for everything that would follow. The great arenas, the famous champions, the emperors who would step into the sand themselves, all of it grew from these modest beginnings, from 6 men fighting at a funeral, from blood spilled in honor of the dead, becoming blood spilled for the entertainment of the living. The Republic was about to transform into an empire, and with that transformation, the games would reach heights of spectacle and excess that the early Romans could never have imagined. But none of it would have been possible without these first steps, without the moment when Romans first discovered their taste for watching men fight to the death, and found that taste agreeable. The story was just beginning. The arena was calling, and Rome, with all its ambition and cruelty and magnificence, was ready to answer. The Roman Republic, in its final century, was a thing of tremendous energy and equally tremendous instability. Power concentrated in fewer hands. Generals commanded legions that were loyal to them personally rather than to the state. Wealth poured in from conquered territories, creating fortunes beyond imagination. And everywhere, in every aspect of Roman life, ambitious men competed for dominance, for glory, for the prize of supreme power. The arena became one of their battlegrounds. In the 1st century before the Common Era, staging magnificent games was no longer just a way to honor the dead or win modest political favor. It had become essential to political success. If you wanted the people's support, if you wanted them to remember your name when voting time came, you gave them spectacle. You gave them blood. You gave them an experience they would talk about for years. The scale of these events grew beyond anything the previous generation had witnessed. Politicians bankrupted themselves staging games. They borrowed enormous sums. They promised their creditors future repayment from the power they would gain. It was a gamble, and many lost everything. But those who won, those who gave the people games so magnificent that the crowd roared their name, found themselves lifted to positions of extraordinary influence. The gladiators themselves were changing. The desperate prisoners of earlier times were still present, certainly, but now they were joined by professional fighters, men trained from youth in specialized schools that had become sophisticated institutions. These schools, the ludi, were businesses now, owned by men called lanistae, who purchased slaves with potential, trained them rigorously, and rented them out for games. The largest and most famous of these schools was in Capua, south of Rome. It could house hundreds of fighters at once. The training was brutal, the discipline absolute. New recruits, whether war captives, condemned criminals, or slaves sold into this life, entered a world governed entirely by violence. They learned to fight with different weapons, to adopt different fighting styles, to become specialists in particular forms of combat. Some became retiari, fighting with net and trident, lightly armored, relying on speed and distance. Others became myrmilones, heavily armored with large shields and short swords. Still others trained as Thracians, as secutares, as dimacheri who fought with 2 swords. Each style had its own techniques, its own strategies, its own aesthetic. The games became more sophisticated, more varied, more entertaining, but they also became more dangerous for the Republic itself, because in these schools, where hundreds of skilled fighters lived together, where men who had been warriors in their homelands were trained to even greater deadliness, there existed a concentration of force that was deeply unstable. These were not free men with loyalty to Rome. These were slaves with every reason to hate their captors. And they were armed, at least during training, and they knew how to kill. In the year 73, before the Common Era, that instability exploded. His name was Spartacus. He was a Thracian, from the mountainous regions north of Greece, a people known for their fierce warriors. He had served as an auxiliary in the Roman army, some sources say, before being enslaved. Others claim he was captured in battle against Rome. The details of his early life are lost to time, but what is certain is that he ended up in the gladiator school at Capua, training to fight and die for Roman entertainment. He was not alone in his resentment. All around him were men who had once been free, who had been soldiers, who had defended their homes before Rome's legions overwhelmed them. They trained together. They ate together. They watched each other being led out to die in the arena. And they waited. The moment came one day in the kitchens. Spartacus and 77 other gladiators seized kitchen knives and whatever weapons they could find. They fought their way out of the school, killing their guards, and escaped into the countryside. It was not a carefully planned rebellion. It was desperate, improvised, the action of men who had decided they would rather die fighting for freedom than live as slaves. The Roman authorities expected to recapture them within days. These were escaped gladiators. After all, not a proper army. A small force of local militia was dispatched to bring them back. It should have been simple. But Spartacus was not a simple man. He was a natural leader, a brilliant tactical mind, someone who understood both Roman military methods and how to use terrain to advantage. When the Roman force found the escaped gladiators camped on Mount Vesuvius, they assumed they had them trapped. The rebels were on the summit. The Romans controlled the only path up. They would starve them out or simply wait for them to surrender. Spartacus had other plans. His men wove ropes from wild vines that grew on the mountainside. In the night, they rappelled down the sheer cliff face that the Romans had assumed was impassable. They circled around behind the unsuspecting Roman force and attacked at dawn. The Romans, caught completely by surprise, were slaughtered. The gladiators took their weapons, their armor, their supplies. News of this victory spread rapidly through southern Italy. To the slave population, to the poor and dispossessed, Spartacus became a symbol of impossible hope. They began to join him, not in dozens, but in hundreds, then thousands. Field slaves fled the plantations. Herdsmen in the hills joined the growing army. Other escaped gladiators from nearby schools made their way to his camp. Within months, Spartacus commanded not 70 men, but 70,000. Consider what this meant. In the heart of Italy, the very core of Roman power, an army of slaves, was growing stronger every day. They were not professional soldiers, most of them, but they were desperate. They were motivated by the most powerful force imaginable, the desire for freedom, and they were led by men who knew how to fight. Rome sent another force to crush them, then another, and another. Spartacus defeated them all. He understood that his ragtag army could not meet Roman legions in open battle, where discipline and training would dominate. So he used mobility, surprise, terrain. He struck where the Romans were weak, vanished when they gathered strength, kept them constantly off balance. For 2 years, this slave army controlled much of southern Italy. They raided Roman estates, they freed more slaves, they accumulated wealth and weapons from their victories. The gladiator who had been trained to die for entertainment was now threatening the very foundation of Roman society. If slaves could rebel successfully, if they could defeat Roman armies, then what did that say about Rome's power? What did it say about the natural order that Romans believed in, the hierarchy that placed them at the top and slaves at the bottom? The Senate was terrified. They appointed Marcus, Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, to command 8 legions and end the rebellion once and for all. Crassus was not a brilliant general, but he was ruthless, and he understood that Rome's reputation was at stake. He revived an ancient punishment called decimation. When one of his legions showed cowardice, he divided them into groups of 10 and made them draw lots. Those who drew the short straw were beaten to death by their fellow soldiers. It was brutal, savage, designed to make his own men more afraid of him than of the enemy. Spartacus knew his time was running short. His army was large, but it was still an army of escaped slaves, poorly equipped compared to Rome's legions, without the infrastructure to sustain a long campaign. He made plans to lead his followers north, across the Alps, where they could disperse into their homelands and live free. But something went wrong. Whether from disagreement among his followers, or a change in strategy, or simply the difficulty of moving such a large force, Spartacus turned south instead. He marched toward the sea, perhaps hoping to find ships that could transport his army away from Italy entirely. Crassus saw his opportunity. He built a fortification across the narrow peninsula where Spartacus's army had camped, a wall from sea to sea, trapping them. Behind the wall, his legions waited. In front of the wall, starvation threatened. Spartacus attempted to break out. On a winter night, he filled in part of the trench with earth and debris, sacrificed some of his animals to create cover, and led a portion of his army across. They broke through, but the army was fragmenting now, different groups pursuing different strategies, the unity that had made them strong beginning to fracture. The end came in the spring of 71 before the Common Era. Crassus's legions caught the main body of Spartacus's army in Lucania. Pompey the Great, returning from Spain with his own legions, was approaching from the north. Spartacus was trapped between two Roman forces. He chose to fight. There was no escape now, no clever maneuver that could save them. This would be a final stand, a last defiant gesture against the power of Rome. Spartacus killed his own horse before the battle, they say, to show his men he would not flee, that he would stand with them until the end. The battle was a slaughter. The Roman legions, fresh and well-equipped and led by experienced commanders, crashed into the slave army with overwhelming force. Spartacus fought like a man possessed, cutting his way toward Crassus himself, trying to reach the general, trying to turn the battle through sheer personal valor. He did not make it. He fell, somewhere in the chaos of combat, surrounded by Roman soldiers, his body lost among thousands of others. 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, the road from Capua to Rome. Their bodies hung on crosses for miles, a grim warning about what happened to slaves who dared to rebel. The sight of them, stretching along that famous road, was meant to inspire terror, to remind every slave in Italy that Rome's power was absolute. But something else happened too, something the Romans did not intend. The story of Spartacus spread far beyond Italy. He became a legend, the slave who had defied an empire, who had won battle after battle against impossible odds, who had given 70,000 people a taste of freedom before the world crushed them back into chains. For the enslaved peoples throughout Rome's territories, he became a symbol. For revolutionaries in later centuries, he became an inspiration. The gladiator who refused to die for entertainment had instead died fighting for something greater. And Rome, having crushed the rebellion, having lined its roads with crucified slaves, having restored order through overwhelming violence, learned a lesson too. The gladiatorial schools were dangerous. Concentrating so many trained fighters in one place created an inherent risk. Security was tightened, the schools were watched more carefully, and the games themselves, paradoxically, became even more important. You see, the rebellion had revealed the deep instability beneath Roman society. The empire was built on slave labor, on conquered peoples, on a foundation of coerced servitude. The games, in their strange way, helped manage this instability. They gave slaves a path, however narrow and bloody, to glory and freedom. They showed that courage could be rewarded, that even the lowest could become celebrities. They provided entertainment that distracted the masses from their grievances. The arena was not just a place of death, it was a pressure valve, a mechanism for channeling dangerous energies into controlled spectacle. And after Spartacus, after the terror his rebellion had inspired in the hearts of Rome's elite, that function became more important than ever. The Republic was stumbling toward its end. Within a generation, Julius Caesar would cross the Rubicon. Civil war would consume Rome. The Republic would fall, and the empire would rise in its place. And when that happened, when emperors replaced senators as the ultimate power in Rome, the games would reach heights of spectacle that would have seemed impossible in Spartacus's time. But the memory of the Thracian gladiator lingered. He had shown that these men, these slaves trained for entertainment, were dangerous in ways Rome had not fully appreciated. They were not just performers, they were warriors, capable of remarkable things when given purpose and leadership. Every time a gladiator stepped into the arena after that, every time the crowd watched a fighter display extraordinary skill or courage, there was perhaps a shadow in the back of their minds, a reminder that these men were not truly tame, that beneath the ritual and ceremony and entertainment, there existed something wild and potentially uncontrollable. The gladiators were Rome's favorite obsession, but they were also a reflection of Rome's greatest fear, that the order they had built, the hierarchy they maintained through force, was more fragile than they wanted to believe. that the people they had conquered and enslaved retained their humanity, their courage, their capacity to resist. Spartacus had forced Rome to confront that truth, and though Rome had won, though it had crucified his followers and reasserted its dominance, the victory was incomplete, because the story survived, the legend grew, and in arenas across the empire, as gladiators fought and died for entertainment, some small part of Spartacus's defiance lived on. The Republic was ending. The empire was about to begin. And in the great arenas that were coming, in the Colosseum that would rise in Rome's heart, the games would reach their ultimate expression. But they would do so with the memory of Spartacus hovering over them, a reminder that spectacle and danger were forever intertwined in the sand. The Roman Republic died in blood and civil war, but from its ashes rose something far more powerful. The empire that emerged under Augustus was wealthier, more organized, more ambitious than anything that had come before. And with that ambition came a desire to stage spectacles that would dwarf anything the Republic had managed. The emperors understood something fundamental about power, that magnificence commands loyalty as surely as fear does. The games became imperial. They were no longer funded by ambitious politicians scrambling for votes. They were gifts from the emperor himself, demonstrations of his wealth, his generosity, his absolute authority. And when emperors compete to outdo their predecessors, when they have the resources of an entire empire at their disposal, the results can be staggering. In the year 80 of the Common Era, Emperor Titus stood before a crowd in Rome and inaugurated a building that would become synonymous with gladiatorial combat for all time. The Flavian Amphitheatre, which we know as the Colosseum, rose 4 stories high, an enormous oval of stone and concrete that could hold 50,000 spectators. It was, and remains, one of the most impressive structures ever built. Consider the engineering required. The Colosseum had 80 entrances, allowing the massive crowd to fill and empty efficiently. It had a complex system of underground chambers and passages called the Hypogeum, where gladiators waited and wild animals were caged. It had elevators and trapdoors that could lift fighters and beasts up into the arena floor, creating dramatic entrances that would astonish the audience. The floor could be flooded for mock naval battles, then drained for traditional combat. It was a machine for spectacle, designed with breathtaking sophistication. For the opening games, Titus spared no expense. 100 days of celebration. From dawn until dusk, day after day for more than 3 months, the people of Rome witnessed an unending parade of combat, of exotic animals, of executions, of spectacles, designed to amaze and horrify and entertain. 9,000 animals died during those games. Lions from North Africa, elephants from beyond the southern deserts, bears from Germania, crocodiles from the Nile, ostriches, leopards, rhinoceroses, creatures that most Romans had never seen, brought at enormous expense across seas and mountains to die in the sand for entertainment. The empire had grown so vast that it could reach into distant continents and extract their wildlife for a few moments of wonder before Roman crowds. And the gladiators, they fought in numbers that staggered even by Rome standards. Paired matches, group battles, exotic combinations designed to showcase different fighting styles. The crowd roared its approval or disdain. The emperor watched from his special box, the ultimate authority over life and death in the arena. This was the golden age of the games. This was when gladiators reached their highest status, when certain fighters became more famous than senators, more beloved than generals. Let me tell you about some of them, these men who lived and fought in the sand. There was Flamma. His name meant flame, and he burned brightly in the arena for years. He was a Syrian by birth, brought to Rome as a slave. He fought as a secutor, the pursuer, heavily armoured with a large rectangular shield and a gladius, designed to hunt down the net-wielding Retiarius. Over his career, Flammer fought 34 recorded fights. He won 21 outright. 9 were declared draws, both fighters deemed too skilled to determine a clear winner. He lost 4 times but survived each defeat. But here is what makes Flammer's story remarkable. 4 different times he was offered the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom, the ultimate reward for a gladiator's service. 4 times he could have walked away, could have lived his remaining years as a free man, and 4 times he refused. He chose to return to the arena, to continue fighting, to remain in the only world where he had found meaning and glory. What compels a man to make such a choice? To choose almost certain death over freedom? Perhaps the arena had become his identity so completely that he could not imagine life outside it. Perhaps the roar of the crowd was a drug more powerful than any substance. Perhaps, having been a slave all his life, he had found that freedom meant nothing compared to the purpose he had discovered in combat. We cannot know his thoughts. We can only observe his choice and wonder at it. Then there were Priscus and Verus, 2 gladiators whose names have survived because of a single, extraordinary fight. Emperor Titus himself watched as these 2 men entered the Colosseum and began to duel. They were perfectly matched. Every attack met a defense, every strategy countered by equal skill. The fight went on and on, neither man able to gain decisive advantage. The crowd, accustomed to quick victories or clear dominance, watched in growing amazement. This was not just combat, this was art. These were 2 masters of their craft, demonstrating the highest possible level of skill. Hours passed. Both men were exhausted, bleeding, barely able to stand, yet neither would yield. Titus, moved by their courage and skill, did something unprecedented. He granted both fighters their freedom. Both received the rudis simultaneously. The crowd erupted in approval. It was a moment of pure triumph, a vindication of the gladiatorial ideal that exceptional courage and skill would be rewarded, that the arena could be a path to glory and freedom. Stories like this spread throughout the empire. They gave the games their mythology, their claim to being more than just slaughter. They suggested that the arena rewarded merit, that a slave could become a hero, that Roman society, despite its rigid hierarchies, had a place where excellence transcended birth. But this mythology existed alongside brutal reality. For every Flammer who won his freedom, hundreds died in obscurity. For every Priscus and Verus celebrating their simultaneous triumph, countless pairs fought and one man fell while the crowd barely noticed. The games consumed lives at an industrial scale, feeding Rome's appetite for spectacle with an endless supply of human bodies. Emperor Nero had his favorite gladiator, a man named Spiculus. When Spiculus won, Nero showered him with gifts, palaces, slaves, gold. The emperor's favor elevated this gladiator to a position of wealth and influence that many senators would have envied. Yet Spiculus was still a slave, still owned, still required to fight when commanded. His privileges existed entirely at the whim of a notoriously unstable emperor. When Nero's reign collapsed, when he was declared an enemy of the state and faced execution, he reportedly called for Spiculus, wanting his favorite gladiator to kill him rather than face death at the hands of his enemies. But Spiculus could not be found in time. Nero died by suicide instead, and Spiculus disappeared from history, his fate unknown. Such was the precarious nature of gladiatorial fame. The games under the emperors reached levels of elaboration that bordered on the fantastical. They flooded the Colosseum's arena floor to stage naumachii, mock naval battles where condemned criminals fought on actual ships, recreating famous historical sea conflicts. The logistics of flooding the arena, bringing in ships, training the combatants to fight naval style, then draining everything and returning the arena to normal. All of this required extraordinary resources and engineering. To understand the gladiators, to truly grasp what their lives were like, we must descend from the grandeur of the Colosseum into the schools where they lived and trained. We must enter the ludus, that strange institution where slaves became warriors, where men learned to kill and die with skill and style. The day began before dawn. In the barracks of the gladiatorial school, men slept in small cells, cramped quarters that offered little comfort. They were awakened by guards and herded into the training yard as the sun rose over the walls that enclosed their world. These walls were high and well guarded. The memory of Spartacus had taught Rome to be cautious. The new arrivals, fresh purchases from the slave markets or newly condemned criminals, stood apart from the veterans. You could see the fear in their eyes, the incomprehension. Many had never held a weapon before. Some were farmers, taken as slaves when their villages were conquered. Others were thieves or debtors, sentenced to the arena for their crimes. A few were prisoners of war, men who had fought against Rome and now would fight for Roman entertainment. The trainers, called doctores, were usually former gladiators themselves, men who had survived long enough to win their freedom and who now made their living teaching others to do the same. They were harsh instructors because gentleness served no purpose here. The arena did not forgive weakness or hesitation. Better to be brutal in training than to send unprepared men to certain death. The recruits learned first with wooden weapons, practicing the basic movements of attack and defense against wooden posts called pales. Hour after hour, day after day, they struck these posts, building muscle memory, developing the strength and endurance that combat demanded. The training was repetitive, exhausting, mind-numbing in its monotony. But it worked. Slowly, gradually, the awkward movements became smoother. The weak bodies grew stronger. Diet was carefully controlled. Gladiators ate primarily barley, beans, and dried fruit. The barley in particular was consumed in such quantities that gladiators were sometimes called horderii, barley men. This diet was high in carbohydrates but relatively low in protein, especially meat. Modern analysis of gladiator bones shows that this diet produced a layer of subcutaneous fat, a padding that could protect against cuts and slashes without impeding movement. The Romans understood, perhaps intuitively, that gladiators needed to be able to bleed impressively without dying immediately, to sustain wounds that looked dramatic but were not instantly fatal, because the economics of gladiatorial combat demanded this. A gladiator represented a significant investment. His purchase price, his training, his equipment, all of this cost money. The lanista who owned the school, the editor who hired gladiators for games, they wanted spectacle, but they did not want their investments dying too quickly. A gladiator who could fight multiple times, who could survive wounds and return to the arena, was far more valuable than one who died in his first match. So the gladiators received medical care that was, by ancient standards, quite sophisticated. The physician Galen, one of the most famous doctors in Roman history, served as physician to a gladiatorial school before treating emperors and senators. He learned anatomy by treating the wounds gladiators sustained, became expert at stitching cuts, setting bones, preventing infections. Gladiators who survived their fights were valuable enough to warrant genuine medical attention. As the recruits progressed in their training, they were assigned to specific fighting styles based on their physical attributes and aptitudes. The Murmillo wore a heavy helmet with a fish crest and carried a large rectangular shield and a short sword. He was designed to be powerful, stable, defensive. The Thracian carried a smaller round shield and a curved sword called a sika, relying more on agility and the ability to hook around his opponent's defense. The Retiarius was perhaps the most distinctive. He wore minimal armor, a shoulder guard on his left arm, nothing else beyond a loincloth. He carried a weighted net and a trident. His strategy was to keep distance, to entangle his opponent in the net, and then to strike with the trident while the other fighter struggled to free himself. He was typically paired against a secutor, a gladiator with a smooth, egg-shaped helmet designed to prevent the net from catching on it. The Secuta's helmet had only small eye holes, limiting his vision. He had to be aggressive, had to close distance quickly before exhaustion set in, because fighting in that helmet in Mediterranean heat was brutally draining. If the Retiarius could keep away, could keep moving, could force the Secuta to chase him around the arena, exhaustion would become an ally. But if the Secuta caught him, if he closed distance and brought his superior armor and weapons to bear, the lightly protected Retiarius was in grave danger. These matchups were carefully designed for drama. Different armor, different weapons, different strategies, each pairing created a distinct type of contest with its own dynamics and suspense. The crowd appreciated the variety, understood the tactical considerations, debated the relative merits of different styles. Within the school, a hierarchy developed. New recruits, called novitius, were at the bottom. They did the menial tasks, received the worst quarters, commanded no respect. Veterans, especially those with multiple victories, held elevated status. They might have better cells, additional privileges, followers among the newer gladiators who hoped to learn from their success. The very best fighters, those who had achieved fame in the arena, lived in a strange twilight zone. They were still slaves, still property, still required to obey, but they also commanded respect that transcended their legal status. A famous gladiator might train younger fighters, might advise the lanista on matches, might even have some say in his own schedule. His value gave him a degree of negotiating power that ordinary slaves could never possess. Friendships formed, inevitably. Men who trained together, who lived together, who faced death together, developed bonds that were deep and complicated. They might be paired against each other in the arena someday. They knew this, yet they still shared their fears, their hopes, their strategies for survival. The gladiatorial world was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and those relationships mattered. Some relationships went beyond friendship. Romans officially disapproved of gladiators as marriage partners. They were infamous, disgraced persons whose profession made them unsuitable for respectable unions. But attraction does not respect social boundaries. Gladiators had affairs with free women, sometimes with noble women who were fascinated by these dangerous men. Some of these relationships were genuine love, others were thrill-seeking, still others were exploitation in various directions. And then there were the female gladiators, the gladiatrixes. Their existence shocked conservative Romans, violated traditional gender roles, seemed to represent the decadence and moral decay that critics saw consuming Roman society. Yet they fought. Historical records and archaeological evidence confirm their presence, though they were far less common than male gladiators. A marble relief found in Halicarnassus shows two female gladiators, Amazon and Achillea, fighting each other. The inscription indicates they fought to an honourable draw and were both released. These were not mythological figures or fantasies. These were real women who trained with weapons and fought in arenas for entertainment. What motivated a woman to become a gladiatrix? Some were slaves, given no choice, trained for novelty value. Others were free women who volunteered, perhaps for the pay, perhaps for the fame, perhaps for reasons we can only speculate about. Roman law eventually tried to forbid women of certain social classes from entering the arena, which suggests the practice was common enough to require legal intervention. The training of female gladiators would have been similar to that of men: repetitive practice, physical conditioning, instruction in specific fighting styles. But they faced additional challenges. Roman society was deeply patriarchal. A woman wielding weapons, fighting publicly, displaying physical prowess in combat. This violated fundamental assumptions about gender roles. The gladiatrixes were transgressive figures, challenging norms simply by existing. Life in the ludus was governed by strict routine: training in the morning, rest during the hottest part of the day, more training in the afternoon, meals at fixed times, sleep in locked cells at night. The monotony was broken only by the tension of knowing that any day you might be selected for the games. Your name might be called, and you would be transported to the arena to face an opponent in front of thousands of spectators. The night before a fight, there was a ritual feast called the Cena Libera, the free dinner. Gladiators scheduled to fight the next day were given an elaborate meal, allowed to eat as much as they wanted, of foods they normally could not afford. It was a last kindness before potential death, but it also served a practical purpose. The public could attend this feast, could see the gladiators who would fight tomorrow, could evaluate them, could place their bets. Some gladiators ate heartily, determined to enjoy what might be their last meal. Others could not stomach food, too nervous about the coming day. Some used the opportunity to send final messages to loved ones, to make arrangements for their meager possessions should they die. It was a strange evening, festive and somber simultaneously, celebration and wait combined. The morning of the games, gladiators were transported to the arena. They waited in the hypogeum, the underground chambers beneath the arena floor, listening to the sounds above. First came the preliminary entertainment, the executions of criminals, sometimes staged as elaborate mythological reenactments, where the condemned played characters who died in famous stories. Then came the animal hunts, the venationes, where trained hunters called venatores fought exotic beasts. And then, finally, it was time for the gladiatorial matches. The gladiators emerged into the light, walked across the sand, saluted the emperor or the editor hosting the games. Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant, Hail Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. Whether they actually said this at every game is debated by historians, but the phrase captures the reality of their situation. Some of them would not return to the hypogeum alive. The fight itself might last minutes or hours, depending on the skill of the combatants and the drama of the contest. The gladiator had to balance genuine fighting with performance. He needed to defeat his opponent, but he also needed to entertain the crowd. Theatrical flourishes, moments of apparent mercy followed by renewed aggression, displays of courage or cunning, all of this played into the spectacle. If wounded and unable to continue, a gladiator could appeal for mercy, could hope that his performance had earned him the crowd's favor. But this was never certain. The crowd was fickle. They might spare a fighter who had shown exceptional courage, or they might demand his death if they felt cheated of entertainment. Everything depended on those moments, on the collective judgment of thousands of strangers deciding whether you deserved to live. If spared, the gladiator returned to the ludus. His wounds would be treated. He would recover, train again, and eventually fight again. Each victory increased his value, his reputation, his chances of eventual freedom. But each fight also brought him closer to the statistical probability that he would not survive. The mortality rate among gladiators was significant, though perhaps not as high as popular imagination suggests. Studies of gladiator cemeteries indicate that many fighters survived multiple matches. The investment in their training and the crowd's preference for skilled combat over immediate slaughter meant that death in the arena, while common, was not inevitable in every fight, but it was always possible. Every time a gladiator entered the arena, he faced genuine danger, and the psychological toll of living with that reality, of knowing that your next fight might be your last, of watching friends and training partners die while you survived, this created a unique mindset, a psychology shaped by proximity to death. Some gladiators became fatalistic, accepting death as inevitable and choosing to face it with courage. Others became superstitious, developing rituals they believed would protect them. Still others simply tried not to think about it, focused on training and technique and the next meal, living day to day because looking further ahead was too painful. And yet, despite everything, the danger, the exploitation, the reality of being property rather than person, some gladiators found meaning in this life. The arena gave them purpose, identity, a path to glory that their circumstances otherwise denied them. Flammo refused freedom 4 times because the arena had become his world. Others felt similarly, even if they did not make the same extreme choice. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the gladiatorial system. It was exploitative, brutal, built on slavery and violence. Yet within that system, individuals found ways to assert agency, to achieve recognition, to become more than their circumstances suggested they could be. The arena was a mechanism of oppression that simultaneously offered a pathway to transcendence. The ludus was where all of this began, where slaves became gladiators, where men learned to navigate the impossible space between fighting for survival and fighting for entertainment. It was a crucible that forged warriors from unwilling material, that transformed the condemned into celebrities, that made death into drama. And every day, in schools across the empire, new recruits picked up wooden swords for the first time, began the brutal training that might lead to glory or might lead to an unmarked grave in the gladiator cemetery outside the city walls. The machine kept running, consuming lives, producing spectacle, feeding Rome's endless appetite for combat in the sand. Power, when absolute, reveals character in ways that ordinary life never could. The Roman emperors held authority beyond anything most humans have ever possessed. They commanded legions, controlled vast wealth, held power of life and death over millions, and some of them, seduced by that power, decided that watching others fight was insufficient. They wanted to enter the arena themselves. This was scandalous beyond measure. An emperor was supposed to embody dignity, authority, the majesty of Rome itself. To descend into the arena, to fight as a gladiator, this was to abandon the distinction between ruler and entertainer, between master and slave. It violated every principle of proper conduct that Roman tradition held sacred. Yet it happened, and the emperor who embraced it most completely, who made the arena his stage and gladiatorial combat his passion, was Commodus. He became emperor in the year 180, inheriting the throne from his father Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who had despised the games even as he attended them dutifully. Marcus Aurelius had been everything Rome admired: learned, disciplined, devoted to duty. His son was his opposite in nearly every way. Commodus loved the arena. He did not merely watch, he participated. He fought as a gladiator, dressed in the costume, wielding the weapons, performing before the Roman people. But these were not fair fights. They were exhibitions carefully managed to ensure the emperor's victory. His opponents were given blunted weapons or were ordered to lose. The outcome was never in doubt. He fought animals as well, hundreds of them. In a single day, he reportedly killed 100 bears, using arrows from a safe platform. He fought ostriches, cutting off their heads with special crescent-shaped arrows, then parading the heads before the crowd as if he had accomplished something remarkable. He killed exotic animals from across the empire: tigers, lions, elephants, always under conditions that gave him overwhelming advantage. He began to style himself as the new Hercules, the legendary hero of myth. He dressed in lion skins, carried a club, had statues erected showing himself in Hercules' iconic poses. The comparison was absurd. Hercules was a demigod who performed impossible labors, while Commodus was an emperor fighting rigged matches, but no one dared laugh. To mock the emperor was to invite death. The Senate despised him. The nobility was horrified. Here was the emperor of Rome, descended from a line of capable and dignified rulers, playing at being a gladiator like a common slave. It was humiliating. It degraded the imperial office. It made Rome itself seem foolish in the eyes of the world. But the common people, at least initially, were entertained. An emperor who fought in the arena, who demonstrated physical courage, even if under carefully controlled conditions, was something novel and exciting. Commodus distributed money to the crowd, staged elaborate games, made himself visible and accessible in ways that previous emperors had not. He charged the Roman treasury enormous sums for his appearances. When he fought as a gladiator, the state had to pay him as if he were a hired professional. Each appearance cost Rome 1,000,000 sesterces, an astronomical sum. He was essentially paying himself with public money to debase the dignity of his office. The treasury hemorrhaged gold while the emperor played in the sand. His reign became increasingly erratic. He executed senators on trumped-up charges. He renamed Rome after himself, calling it Colonia Commodiana, Commodus's colony. He renamed the months of the year after his various titles. He declared himself a god and demanded worship. The line between confidence and madness blurred and then disappeared. In the end, his own household killed him. A conspiracy involving his mistress and his chamberlain poisoned him, and when the poison failed to work quickly enough, a wrestler was sent to strangle him in his bath. He died at age 31, having ruled for 12 years, leaving Rome traumatized by his excesses. But Commodus was not the only emperor to enter the arena, merely the most excessive. Others had dabbled in gladiatorial pursuits before him. Nero, decades earlier, had fought in private exhibitions, though he had enough shame to not perform in public games within Rome itself. He did fight publicly in Naples, where he felt less constrained by traditional Roman dignity. Caligula, that earlier mad emperor, had been fascinated by gladiators. He supposedly fought in private, trained with gladiatorial weapons, fantasized about being a warrior. His cruelty extended to the games themselves. He enjoyed feeding criminals to wild animals, sometimes ordering men to be killed simply because he was bored with other entertainment. He would close the awnings over the Colosseum on particularly hot days, trapping the crowd in the sun, refusing to let anyone leave while he enjoyed their discomfort. Even more stable emperors used the games as political tools, as demonstrations of power and generosity. Trajan, conquering Dacia and bringing its gold back to Rome, celebrated with games lasting 123 days. 10,000 gladiators fought. 11,000 animals died. The spectacle was meant to cement his reputation, to associate his rule with magnificence and plenty. The games he staged were elaborate beyond anything seen before. He had the arena floor modified to create landscapes, forests where animals could hide, elevated platforms for archers, even artificial hills. He recreated famous battles with gladiators playing soldiers on both sides. He staged hunts where rare animals were pursued through constructed terrain. Every day brought new wonders, new variations, new reasons for the crowd to marvel at imperial generosity. Marcus Aurelius, despite his personal distaste for the games, understood their political necessity. He attended regularly, showed proper interest, fulfilled his duty as emperor to provide entertainment to the people. But he brought documents with him, conducted imperial business while gladiators fought below. He wrote in his meditations about the pointlessness of the spectacle, the waste of life, the vulgarity of the crowd's bloodlust. Yet he could not end the games. They were too popular, too ingrained in Roman culture. An emperor who tried to abolish them would face massive public backlash. The games were, by this point, an institution that transcended any individual's preferences. They employed thousands of people, trainers, arena staff, animal handlers, merchants who supplied equipment and exotic beasts. They represented a massive economic system. They served political functions, providing entertainment that distracted from problems and bought public loyalty. They fulfilled social roles, offering a venue where Romans of all classes mingled and shared experiences, and they had become part of Roman identity. To be Roman was, in some sense, to attend the games, to understand their conventions, to participate in the communal experience of watching combat. The arena was where Rome gathered to be Rome, where the empire's diversity momentarily unified in shared fascination with spectacle. Some emperors staged naumachii, those mock naval battles that required flooding the arena or using specialized venues. Augustus had staged the first truly massive naumachia, excavating an artificial lake near the Tiber and filling it with water. 30 warships, carrying thousands of condemned prisoners, playing the roles of Greek and Persian forces, fought until 3,000 men were dead. The scale was unprecedented, the logistics staggering. Claudius later staged a naumachia on the Fucine Lake, using 19,000 combatants in a recreation of a battle between Rhodian and Sicilian fleets. The condemned men who would fight reportedly saluted Claudius with the famous phrase, "Those who are about to die salute you." Claudius jokingly replied, "Or not," suggesting they might be pardoned. The fighters took this seriously and refused to fight, thinking they had been granted mercy. Claudius had to send guards among them, threatening and killing some, before the survivors agreed to fight as planned. These naumachii required extraordinary resources, building ships, training prisoners to sail and fight, creating the infrastructure to flood venues, all of it at tremendous expense for a single day's entertainment. But the emperors considered it worthwhile. The spectacle demonstrated their power to command resources, to bend nature itself to their will, to create wonders that would be remembered for generations. Nero had flooded part of the Colosseum for a naumachia early in its history. The Hypogeum, that elaborate underground system, was partially built later, which is how the flooding was possible. Watching ships sail where usually gladiators fought, seeing naval combat in the heart of Rome, was meant to amaze and delight the crowd. The engineering alone was impressive enough to command respect. Different emperors approached the games differently. Some, like Trajan, used them to celebrate military victories and display spoils of conquest. Others, like Hadrian, who travelled extensively throughout the empire, staged games in various provinces, bringing Roman entertainment to distant territories, reinforcing imperial culture across diverse populations. The games served to unify the empire. From Britain to Africa, from Spain to Syria, Romans and provincials watched similar spectacles, appreciated the same types of combat, cheered for their favourite gladiators. The arena became a shared language, a common cultural touchstone that bound together populations who otherwise had little in common. But the games also revealed empire's darker elements. The constant need for fresh gladiators and animals meant constant raids into frontier territories for captives and wildlife. The demand for exotic animals drove some species toward local extinction. Lions from North Africa, bears from the European forests, creatures from every corner of the known world, all funneled toward Rome to die in the sand. It was unsustainable, an extraction of life from the natural world on an industrial scale. The emperors who embraced the games most enthusiastically often reigned during periods of instability or decline. Commodus ruled during a time when the empire was beginning to show strain. The easy conquests were over. The frontiers were increasingly difficult to defend. Economic problems were emerging. Perhaps the elaborate games were a distraction, a way to avoid confronting deeper issues, a spectacle that could temporarily make people forget their troubles. Or perhaps the correlation runs the other direction. Perhaps strong, confident empires can afford to be restrained, while weakening ones need ever greater spectacles to maintain the illusion of power. The games grew more elaborate, more expensive, more extreme over time, even as the empire that funded them slowly weakened. The relationship between emperors and gladiators was complex and revealing. These were slaves, yet emperors paid attention to them, rewarded the successful ones, sometimes befriended them. Spiculus received palaces from Nero. Other famous gladiators gained imperial favor through their performances. The emperor and the gladiator, seemingly separated by an unbridgeable social gulf, were connected through the arena, in ways that confused traditional hierarchies. When Commodus fought as a gladiator, he was attempting to claim some of that mystique, that aura of danger and courage that successful gladiators possessed. But he could not truly access it, because everyone knew he fought rigged matches, that his victories were staged, that he faced no real danger. He wanted the glory without the risk, the celebration without the sacrifice. And in that desire, he revealed something about power that it ultimately rings hollow if not tested by genuine challenge. The emperors shaped the games through their patronage and participation, but the games also shaped the emperors. The constant exposure to violence, to death as entertainment, to the cheers of crowds watching human suffering, this warped perspective made cruelty seem normal, even celebratory. Caligula's sadism, Nero's theatricality, Commodus's delusions all were influenced by growing up in a culture where watching people die was considered appropriate family entertainment. Yet the games persisted, generation after generation, emperor after emperor. They had become too important to abandon, too lucrative to end, too popular to eliminate. The Colosseum stood in Rome's heart, and its sand remained perpetually stained with blood, a testament to empire's appetite for spectacle and its capacity to make entertainment from human mortality. The emperors and the blood they commanded, the games they staged, the excesses they enabled, all of it represented Rome at its most magnificent and most terrible. The same civilization that built aqueducts and roads, that created lasting literature and sophisticated law, also built elaborate mechanisms for killing in the name of fun. And the emperors, those men with power to change anything, largely chose to perpetuate and expand the system they inherited, because doing so brought them popularity, distraction, and the strange satisfaction of being the center of history's grandest show. Nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not institutions, not traditions that seem permanent and unchangeable. The gladiatorial games, which had defined Roman entertainment for centuries, which had survived the transition from republic to empire, which had spread across the Mediterranean world, were built on foundations that were slowly crumbling. The 3rd century of the Common Era brought crisis to Rome. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, sometimes lasting only months before being assassinated or overthrown. The frontiers, which had once expanded steadily outward, now contracted under pressure from migrating peoples. The economy strained under the weight of maintaining legions, fortifications, and the vast administrative apparatus of empire. And yet, even in crisis, the games continued. They had become too ingrained, too essential to Roman identity. But they were changing, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, as new forces reshaped Roman civilization. Christianity was spreading. What had begun as a minor Jewish sect in the eastern provinces had, by the 3rd century, become a significant presence throughout the empire. Christians met in secret, practiced their rituals away from public view, and held beliefs that put them in fundamental opposition to core aspects of Roman culture. They opposed the games, not quietly, not with polite disagreement, but with passionate conviction. The Christian worldview held that every human life was sacred, that all people were equal before God, that violence for entertainment was abhorrent. The arena represented everything. Christianity rejected the celebration of death, the exploitation of the powerless, the reduction of human beings to objects for amusement. Early Christian writers condemned the games in the strongest terms. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, called the arena a place of demons, where Christians who attended risked their immortal souls. He described the crowd's bloodlust in horrified detail, seeing in their enthusiasm for violence a spiritual corruption that imperiled the entire civilization. Augustine, in a famous passage, told the story of a Christian friend named Alypius, who was dragged to the games against his will. Alypius vowed to keep his eyes closed, to not participate in the spectacle. But when the crowd roared at a particularly dramatic moment, he opened his eyes, and in that moment he was captured. The violence seized him, the drama overwhelmed his resistance, and he found himself cheering along with everyone else. Augustine used this story to illustrate the game's demonic power, their ability to corrupt even those who came determined to resist. The Christians were not wrong to see the games as fundamentally opposed to their values. The arena was built on principles that Christianity rejected: hierarchy, enforced through violence, entertainment derived from suffering, human life treated as disposable. As Christianity grew, it brought with it a moral framework that could not easily accommodate gladiatorial combat. But Christianity alone could not have ended the games. Religious opposition existed, but so did enormous inertia, economic interests, and popular demand. What Christianity provided was a new language for opposition, a moral vocabulary that made criticism of the games respectable in ways it had not been before. The empire's economic decline mattered more practically. Staging magnificent games required resources, money to purchase gladiators and animals, infrastructure to maintain arenas, administrative capacity to organize events. As the 3rd century crisis deepened, as civil wars consumed resources and frontiers demanded constant military attention, fewer resources remained for entertainment. The exotic animal trade, which had supplied the Venationes with creatures from across the known world, became more difficult and expensive. The trade routes that had once moved goods freely across the empire were disrupted by warfare and instability. The populations of wild animals in accessible regions were depleted by centuries of hunting for the arena. A bear from Germania or a lion from North Africa, which had once been expensive but obtainable, became rare and prohibitively costly. The great Laniste, the businessmen who had built fortunes training and renting gladiators, found their economic model becoming less viable. The demand remained, but the ability to supply enough trained fighters at a price that made business sense was eroding. Some schools closed, others operated at reduced capacity. The supply of professional gladiators, never infinite, began to contract. Smaller cities, which had enthusiastically built their own arenas during the empire's prosperous centuries, found they could no longer afford to maintain them or stage regular games. Provincial arenas fell into disrepair. Local games became less frequent, less elaborate, pale shadows of the magnificent spectacles that had once been common. Rome itself could still stage impressive games, drawing on the empire's remaining resources, but even in the capital, the frequency and scale were diminishing. The economic reality was that the empire could no longer afford its own entertainment. And then there was Constantine. He became emperor in 306 and changed Rome's course forever. In 313 he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire. Christianity, which had been periodically persecuted, became legal, acceptable, increasingly mainstream. Constantine himself converted to Christianity, though the sincerity and timing of his conversion are debated by historians. What is certain is that imperial patronage transformed Christianity from a minority sect into the empire's dominant religion, and with Christianity's rise came increased pressure on institutions that conflicted with Christian values. Constantine banned certain practices associated with the games. He forbade branding criminals on the face, since the face bore God's image. He attempted to restrict the sending of criminals to gladiatorial schools, though this restriction was not fully enforced. He was moving, cautiously, toward limiting the games without eliminating them entirely. The games had survived for so long partly because they served multiple functions simultaneously. They were entertainment, certainly, but also political tools, economic enterprises, cultural traditions, and mechanisms for maintaining social order. Ending them required addressing all these functions, finding alternatives or accepting their loss. But the momentum was shifting. Each generation of Christians was more confident, more numerous, more influential. The moral arguments against the games gained force. What had once seemed normal, even admirable, watching skilled fighters duel to death, began to seem barbaric to more and more people. The story that has come down to us, perhaps legendary but representing a deeper truth, centers on a monk named Telemachus. In the year 404, during games in Rome, this monk reportedly ran into the arena and placed himself between two fighting gladiators, attempting to stop the combat. The crowd, outraged at this interruption of their entertainment, stoned him to death. They killed him there in the arena, his blood joining the countless others who had died in the sand. But his death became a catalyst. Emperor Honorius, whether moved by the monk's sacrifice or by broader political considerations, issued a decree officially banning gladiatorial combat. The year was 404 of the Common Era. More than 6 centuries had passed since the first recorded gladiatorial match in Rome. For all that time, the games had been a central feature of Roman life, had shaped Roman culture, had consumed tens of thousands of lives in service of entertainment, and now, with a single decree, they were officially ended. But ending them officially and ending them in practice were different things. The decree banned gladiatorial combat specifically, but other arena entertainments continued. Animal hunts persisted for another century. Executions of criminals in the arena continued even longer. The Colosseum and other arenas remained in use, though no longer for gladiatorial matches. In some provinces, far from imperial oversight, traditional gladiatorial games may have continued for years or decades after the official ban. Old traditions die slowly, especially when they are loved by the people and profitable for those who stage them. But the institutional support was gone, the official sanction withdrawn, the cultural acceptance eroding. The barbarian invasions accelerated the decline of everything Roman, including the games. As Germanic peoples moved into Western territories, as political control fragmented, as Roman infrastructure decayed, the capacity to stage elaborate spectacles disappeared. The complex systems required for gladiatorial games, the training schools, the supply networks, the maintained arenas, all depended on stable governance and economic surplus. Both were vanishing. The Colosseum itself fell into neglect. Parts of it were damaged by earthquakes. Stones were scavenged for other building projects. It became home to squatters, was used as a fortress during medieval conflicts, slowly transformed from the empire's greatest arena into a ruin that testified to Rome's former glory. The last generations of gladiators disappeared from history. Men who had trained their entire lives for combat in the arena found their profession suddenly obsolete. Some perhaps became soldiers, their martial skills still valuable in an age of constant warfare. Others vanished into the general population of slaves and freedmen, their identities as gladiators becoming irrelevant. The end of the games was not a single moment, but a process that unfolded over decades. It was the result of multiple forces: Christian opposition, economic decline, barbarian invasions, changing values, the simple exhaustion of a tradition that had lasted too long. Each factor alone might have been insufficient, but together they created unstoppable momentum toward ending an institution that had seemed permanent. Looking back, we can see the inevitability of this ending. The games were built on assumptions about human value, about entertainment, about the proper relationship between power and spectacle that could not survive indefinitely. They belonged to a particular time and culture, and when that culture transformed, the games could not adapt. But in their moment, to those who loved them or depended on them, the end must have seemed tragic. The roar of the crowd, the clash of weapons, the drama of life and death in the sand, all of it was ending. The gladiators who had been celebrities, who had commanded attention and admiration, were becoming anachronisms, relics of a dying age. Some Romans, particularly Christians, celebrated the end. They saw it as moral progress, as civilization finally rejecting barbarism, as humanity taking a step toward greater compassion. Others mourned the loss. They saw it as the decline of Roman vigor, as softness replacing strength, as the empire losing something essential to its character. Both perspectives held partial truth. The games had been both magnificent and terrible, had revealed humanity's capacity for both extraordinary courage and casual cruelty. Their ending represented both moral progress and cultural loss, both improvement and decline, depending on what one valued. The silence that fell over the Colosseum, over the provincial arenas, over all the spaces where crowds had gathered to watch men fight and die was profound. For centuries, these spaces had been alive with sound, the roar of crowds, the clash of steel, the cries of wounded fighters, the snarls of animals. Now they stood empty, the sand undisturbed, the spectacle concluded. The last gladiator to fight in Rome is unknown to history. His name was not recorded. No one marked the occasion as significant, because no one realized it was the last time. He fought, perhaps won, perhaps died, and then there were no more. The institution simply faded away, year by year, decade by decade, until one day there were no gladiators left, only memories and ruins. The world moved on. Rome fell. New civilizations rose from its remains. But the memory of the gladiators persisted, passed down through historical accounts, through archaeological remains, through the stories that cultures tell themselves about their past. The games were over, but their legacy was just beginning its journey through history. 2,000 years have passed since the height of the gladiatorial games. The Colosseum still stands in Rome, though now it is a shell, a monument to what once was. The sand that soaked up so much blood has long since blown away. The underground chambers where gladiators waited are exposed to sky and weather. The roar of 50,000 spectators has faded into silence. Yet the gladiators have not been forgotten. Their story continues to fascinate us, continues to raise questions about violence and entertainment, about courage and exploitation, about what it means to be human. The echoes of the arena still resonate through our culture, our sports, our understanding of ourselves. Walk through any museum with Roman artifacts, and you will find them there. Mosaic floors depicting famous fighters, their names preserved in tiny tiles. Flamma the Syrian, who refused freedom. Priscus and Verus, whose perfectly matched duel earned them both liberty. Gladiators whose names meant nothing to Roman elites, but everything to the crowds who watched them fight. Graffiti scratched into walls in Pompeii and Herculaneum. Cities frozen by volcanic ash preserves the casual devotion of fans. Celadus the Thracian, the girl's heartthrob. Crescens the net fighter, doctor to the girls by night. These were not official monuments. They were spontaneous expressions of admiration, the ancient equivalent of fan clubs and celebrity worship. Archaeologists have excavated gladiator cemeteries, and the bones tell stories that historical texts cannot. The skeletons show healed wounds, evidence of repeated injuries sustained over multiple fights. These were not men who died in their first combat. They survived, recovered, fought again. Some bones show evidence of excellent medical care, cleanly set fractures, surgical interventions, signs that valuable fighters received sophisticated treatment. Other bones show the manner of death, a skull with a square hole punched through it, exactly the size and shape of the hammer that was used to finish wounded gladiators who would not survive their injuries. The coup de grace, delivered with precision, ending suffering but also ending life. The skeleton cannot tell us whether that gladiator welcomed death after a career in the arena, or whether he died terrified, his dreams of freedom unfulfilled. The cemeteries reveal demographics too. Most gladiators died young, in their 20s or early 30s. A few lived longer, veteran fighters who had survived dozens of matches. The graves sometimes contained offerings, pottery, lamps, coins for the afterlife journey. Someone mourned these men. Someone cared enough to honor their passing, even though they were slaves, even though Roman society officially deemed them worthless. Medieval Europe, that Christian civilization that had rejected gladiatorial games as barbaric, nonetheless created its own version of ritualized combat. The knightly tournament, with its elaborate rules and pageantry, served similar functions to the Roman arena. It provided entertainment, allowed warriors to display skill, created celebrities whose fame spread across kingdoms. The differences were significant, certainly. Tournaments were intended to be less lethal, though deaths still occurred. The participants were free nobles rather than slaves. The cultural context was entirely different, yet the basic human appetite for watching skilled fighters test themselves against each other, for combat as spectacle, for violence rendered meaningful through ritual, all of this persisted. In our own time, the connections are even more obvious. Boxing, mixed martial arts, professional wrestling, all draw on the same fundamental appeal that filled the Colosseum. We watch athletes with specialized skills face each other in controlled environments, following established rules, competing for our entertainment. We make celebrities of successful fighters. We debate their techniques, their courage, their place in history. The differences matter, of course. Modern combat sports have safety regulations, medical supervision, the possibility of retirement. The fighters are free professionals who choose their careers. No one forces them into the ring at sword point. The mortality rate, while not zero, is vastly lower than what gladiators faced. Yet the emotional dynamics are strikingly similar. We still thrill to displays of physical courage. We still create narratives around fighters, their backgrounds, their rivalries, their personal struggles. We still gather in large numbers to watch combat, whether in person or through screens. The technology has changed, the ethics have evolved, but the fundamental human fascination with watching skilled fighters compete remains. Films and novels have repeatedly returned to gladiatorial themes. Spartacus has been portrayed countless times, his rebellion transformed into a story about freedom and resistance that resonates across centuries. Modern audiences, who would never attend actual gladiatorial games, nonetheless pack theatres to watch dramatized versions, to imagine themselves in that world, to experience vicariously the drama of the arena. The Colosseum itself has become one of the world's most recognized landmarks, a symbol of Rome, but also something larger. It represents human capability for both architectural achievement and moral failure. It stands as a warning about what civilizations can normalize, about how entertainment can justify cruelty, about the ease with which we can make spectacle from suffering. UNESCO designated it a World Heritage Site. Millions of tourists visit each year, walking through corridors where gladiators once prepared for combat, standing in the arena where so many died. They take photographs. They try to imagine what it was like when the space was filled with spectators, when combat was happening below, when this ruin was alive with sound and movement and death. What are they seeking in these visits? Perhaps connection to history, to a dramatic and terrible past, perhaps the thrill of standing where significant events occurred, perhaps simply the tourist's desire to see famous places. But there is something deeper too, a recognition that the gladiators, for all their distance in time and culture, were human like us. They feared and hoped, they struggled and sometimes triumphed. They found meaning in circumstances that sought to deny them humanity. The story of the gladiators forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. We are capable of great courage and great cruelty, sometimes simultaneously. We can recognize the humanity in others while still treating them as objects. We can create systems that are both magnificent and terrible, that showcase our highest abilities while serving our lowest impulses. Consider what the games reveal about entertainment itself. The need for spectacle, for drama, for experiences that take us outside our ordinary lives, this is deeply human. But so is the ease with which we can consume others' suffering for our amusement, can distance ourselves from pain we witness, can justify almost anything if it is sufficiently entertaining. The Romans were not monsters, not fundamentally different from us. They were humans who had normalized certain practices, who had built institutions around certain assumptions, who lived in a culture that made gladiatorial combat seem acceptable, even admirable. And this should trouble us, because it suggests how easily any culture can normalize what later generations will recognize as atrocity. The gladiators themselves remain enigmatic figures. We have their names, their records, their bones. We have descriptions of their fights and accounts of their fame. But their inner lives, their true thoughts and feelings, remain largely inaccessible. Did Flamma refuse freedom because he loved fighting, or because freedom held no meaning for someone who had been enslaved since childhood? Did the gladiators who fought courageously do so from genuine bravery or from trained reflex? We can speculate, but we cannot know. What we can know is that they were individuals, not just statistics or entertainment. Each had a story, a personality, dreams that may have been impossible but were no less real for their impossibility. The graffiti praising Saladus suggests he had charm beyond his fighting ability. The paired burial of two gladiators found in York suggests friendship, or perhaps love, between men who faced death together. The medical care given to wounded fighters suggests that someone valued their continued survival, even if only for economic reasons. The legacy of the gladiators is complex and contradictory. They represent courage and exploitation, entertainment and cruelty, human excellence and human brutality. They show us what people can endure, what skills they can develop, what meaning they can find even in the worst circumstances. They also show us what civilizations can justify, what suffering they can ignore, what horrors they can make entertaining. In archaeology, researchers continue to study gladiatorial remains, using modern techniques to extract new information from ancient bones and artifacts. DNA analysis, isotope studies, detailed examination of skeletal trauma all contribute to a more nuanced understanding of who these people were, where they came from, how they lived and died. One skull shows evidence of 3 separate head wounds, all healed, before the final blow that killed its owner. This gladiator survived 3 different occasions when he could have died, recovered each time, and returned to fight again. Then, on the 4th occasion, his luck or skill finally failed. That skull represents a life of repeated trauma, of survival against odds, of a death that was perhaps inevitable given the career, but was no less final for being expected. Another skeleton, found in a gladiator cemetery in Turkey, belonged to a man in his 20s with massive muscular development in his right arm and shoulder, consistent with years of sword training. He stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall, average for the time. He had broken his left leg earlier in life, had suffered multiple blade wounds that healed, and had finally died from a wound to the skull. He was buried with a lamp, suggesting someone honored his passing. These were real people. That seems obvious, but it is worth stating explicitly. The games abstracted them into entertainment, into symbols, into instruments for imperial glory or political advancement. But they were human beings who felt pain and fear, who dreamed of better lives, who formed relationships and had preferences, and possessed the full complexity of human consciousness. The arena has been empty for 16 centuries. The institution that consumed so many lives, that defined Roman entertainment, that shaped an empire's culture, ended long ago. But the questions it raises remain relevant. How do we balance our appetite for spectacle with ethical treatment of those who provide it? What responsibilities do audiences bear for the systems that entertain them? Where is the line between acceptable violence and entertainment that crosses into exploitation? Modern combat sports grapple with these questions constantly. Concerns about brain injuries in boxing and football, debates about fair compensation for athletes, discussions about the ethics of violent entertainment all echo the moral arguments that eventually helped end the gladiatorial games. We have not resolved these tensions. We have simply found different equilibrium points, different compromises between our desire for spectacle and our ethical concerns. The gladiators would recognize something of themselves in modern fighters. The training regimen, the celebrity status, the physical courage required, the way skill and showmanship must combine for success. All of this bridges the centuries, but they would also recognize profound differences in freedom, in agency, in the fundamental relationship between fighter and audience. As we stand in the ruins of the Colosseum, as we contemplate the world the gladiators inhabited, we are looking both backward and inward. We are examining a civilization that was capable of extraordinary achievements and terrible cruelties, often simultaneously. And in that examination, we are inevitably examining ourselves, our own societies, our own compromises and justifications and blind spots. The sand of the arena has blown away. The blood has long since been absorbed by the earth. The crowds have dispersed across 2 millennia, but the story endures because it speaks to something fundamental about being human, our capacity for courage in the face of death, our ability to find meaning in suffering, our talent for creating beauty from cruelty, our need to gather and watch as others risk everything for our entertainment. The gladiators are gone. The games are over. The empire that created them has fallen into dust. But the echoes remain, resonating through time, asking us to consider what we value, what we are willing to consume for amusement, what we owe to those who entertain us, and what it means to be both spectator and human being. In the end, the gladiators were us human beings trying to survive impossible circumstances, seeking meaning and dignity where little was offered, demonstrating both the worst and best of what we are capable of becoming. Their story is our story, reflected in the brutal mirror of the arena, showing us truths about ourselves that are sometimes difficult to face but important to remember. The Colosseum stands, the bones remain, the names are preserved in graffiti and mosaics, and 2,000 years later, we still gather to hear their story, still fascinated by those who fought and died in the sand, still searching in their lives for insights into our own. The games are over, but the conversation continues, echoing through centuries, asking questions we still struggle to answer.